Hey everybody. So I had a conversation with Bhaskar Sunkara, who is the founder and editor of Jacobin magazine. This discussion was held at the Jacobin HQ in Brooklyn, New York, and it took place on Monday, June 17th. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so I just blew through your name and then totally humiliated myself. So can you just remind me who you are? So I feel like I've read it so many times that it's just kind of I have my own internal pronunciation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even though it's Bhaskar Sunkara.
Right.
But even the way that I pronounce it is because my mom is Trinidadian and can't pronounce the proper Hindi version of my name, which is like aspirated H. But anyway, Bhaskar Sunkara. I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin and the author of a fine new volume called The Socialist Manifesto. I forgot my own subtitle.
You're too good at this elevator pitch already.
The case for
people are tuning out of this
radical
podcast.
Politics in the era of extreme inequality.
Yeah,
there we go.
I did. I received a free copy,
Yes.
courtesy of your publisher. So thank you.
Do you need that disclosure for journalistic reasons?
Probably not, but people would probably devise conspiracy theories out of it regardless. So maybe I shouldn't have bothered disclosing. I also want to state for the record that I had a column published today in the Wall Street Journal, and now on the very same day, I'm sitting here in the headquarters of Jacobin magazine talking about a book entitled The Socialist Manifesto, which is just to say all things are possible.
Anything is possible, like Kevin Garnett once said.
He did. Speaking of not exactly Kevin Garnett, but the NBA, if somebody was just a casual follower of your social media habits, they might think that you're just like one of these NBA guys.
I would say about 5 to 7%, a woefully low percentage of my following, but a significant, statistically significant percent of my following is the NBA Twitter world.
Right.
And I'm quite a conservative in the NBA Twitter world.
Oh, really?
Well, I don't do the the Knicks are terrible, LOL Knicks thing. I'm often an apologist for Scott Perry in the Knicks front office, so I'm an established.
Well, I was going to ask you, what is the proper materialistic understanding of the Raptors defeating the Warriors?
Well, the materialistic explanation is that the Warriors had health problems, and then their bodies were materially, crippled, and they, the better team was more injured. So I think that's it.
I was thinking in terms of Silicon Valley overexerting itself and crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions or something.
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
I can't do that with sports. I like sports too much. I can't. I don't like the idea even when people are like, "Oh, it's a blue collar team. It's a blue collar city." I'm like, every fucking city is a blue collar city. But some cities just wear it on their sleeve a little bit more.
That's true. Although, can San Francisco really be said to be a blue collar city?
Yeah, San Francisco is no longer a blue collar city for sure.
It might be the one exception.
Yeah, it's a mix of the extremely rich and the homeless that they scoff at, and the working class is being rapidly pushed out of the city.
Right. Well, that's why I tried fruitlessly to interweave some kind of grand political narrative of the Warriors being defeated. Although I don't know how I would incorporate Toronto into that.
Yeah, I mean, Toronto is similar in that, Toronto is like an oasis of international capital, but it's surrounded by, areas that remind you of a lot of the Northeast, kind of very Rust Belty, very deprived, opioid epidemic, or whatever.
The base of the Ford dynasty.
Oh yes, exactly. They're
those outer borough, or whatever you'd call it.
Well, if you're a New Yorker like us, or from the New York area, then Ontario is a lot more familiar probably than California.
Yeah. No, it's true. I drove through there for the first time last fall, and I was struck. I mean, I shouldn't have been struck by the similarities, but you kind of have to be just because it's technically a foreign country.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more similarity there than other parts of the United States.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so you have this book, which I did read, and I clarified to you that unlike other of your interviewers potentially, I actually did read the book, and so that should earn me some plaudits right off the bat.
Well, that diffuses my number one counter to people's criticism. Read the book.
Read the book.
Now I can't do that. I'm at a loss. I might lose this interview.
Well, maybe. Well, I mean, you could challenge me that I have an incorrect interpretation of the book, perhaps.
That just means that I didn't write the book properly.
Right? Maybe, or I'm just really stupid, which a lot of people online would contend. Okay, so a lot of it is just like history, right? Or you're doing a historical account of, a nutshell version of socialist movements dating back to the 19th century. And you do seem to make an extra effort to not just acknowledge, but explicitly bemoan the excesses and authoritarian manifestations of various socialistic movements. And I know that's always a counterpoint on the right, which is that socialists don't grapple with that legacy. But you clearly do. You said, under authoritarian regimes, Marxism was turned into a science that allowed no room for doubt. And you said that socialism became synonymous with a bloodied collectivism. Are we at a point now where you making those disclaimers is kind of sufficient? Is that like an adequate reckoning with the legacy, or how do you kind of think about that aspect of what you did?
Well, I think we have to actually look at the contexts in which this authoritarianism took root. One was out of the devastation of the Great War and Civil War and famine that you had in Russia. Similar context in China, which had survived Civil War, Japanese invasion, imperialism, and whatever else. These are extremely backward, war-weary societies in which a small group of people pushing a modernization project from above, they had varying degrees of legitimacy, and it fueled a certain type of socialism. A type of socialism that was meant to catch up with and compete with the West, not really have what Marx and Engels envisioned, which was socialism arising from, the most self-conscious and confident part of kind of the working class, movement. So you had a socialist movement being led by a vanguard of intellectuals with peasant backing in China. And I think it's just very different from the situation here. And in the United States, socialists fought for not only political democracy and certain rights and guarantees like that, but also, socialists were the test case for things like the clear and present danger principle. The basic civil rights were fought for and guaranteed by the efforts of socialists. So we've been on the right side of history, been on the right side of all these struggles to expand democracy from just merely the formal political sphere into social and economic spheres as well, to defend the existing democracy we have, fighting for civil rights, fighting against racism, all these things. The socialist record is actually pretty clean in the United States. Yep. So we don't have that much to apologize for. That being said, we do have to, think about what went wrong in these societies. And I think we have to remember that the democratic part of democratic socialists comes first. We believe in free civil societies. We believe that we have to win competitive elections. We believe that any process of social transformation has to be reversible. And in fact, if you make it so that you think your revolutionary process is irreversible, in fact, you're just going to set yourself up for a big collapse down the road. Today, me and you tomorrow can go start a monarchist political party in the United States. We're not going to get more than 0.1% support. In my vision of a just, egalitarian social society, 10 years in, if someone's going to start a party fighting for capitalist restoration, it's only going to get 2-3%. It's going to be a fringe novelty. But it doesn't mean they don't have the right to do that.
Yeah, and well, you say that the solution essentially in terms of counteracting the tendency or the danger toward authoritarianism is to enshrine and protect civil liberties and civil rights. And I can almost hear, the conservative troll in my head saying, "Oh, you're saying you're in favor of civil liberties now," but the left, and when they usually say that, they mean kind of like online cultural liberals. They're no longer into free speech, so they want to abolish free speech. I mean, they're not. They hate the First Amendment now. Is there any legitimacy? Is there a kernel of legitimacy to that line of criticism?
I mean, I think the most constant, largest violations of free speech today is by employers on their employees. It's by big corporations like Facebook, deciding who gets a platform, who doesn't get a platform. It's not coming from some kids on college campuses. And also a lot of these kids have a very tenuous connection to the actual left, the history of the left or whatnot. Mm. So I would say that, it's important that the left sticks to, relatively, a version of free speech that I think resembles a lot of what is mainstream in the United States, which is something similar to you can't yell fire in a burning theater. You can't maybe say, you're going to kill this person, this group of people tomorrow in a particular way. But otherwise, speech should be unregulated.
Yep.
I think that my view is, or this, what I just expressed, is still probably consensus within the organized socialist movement, and historically has been. Mm-hmm. If anything, we've been excessively suspicious of the state and kind of state interference with speech and things like that. But that's our legacy, and I guess maybe it's just a counter reaction. But I hear the stories about certain things that go on campus, and my initial thinking is like, this is a bit like either ridiculous or unintentionally funny or just kind of like not politics, apolitical.
Right.
But then when conservatives, yeah, exactly. But when conservatives amplify it to the point where this is like a rising trend in society, it just doesn't resonate with what is mass politics in the U.S. Therefore, my initial recourse, beyond just dismissing some of that, is just to point out that, employers and corporations are still by far the greatest violators of free speech in the U.S. And a lot of what you have as far as like censor like behavior among fringe groups on campuses or among like a small group of like very hyperactive liberals on Twitter, like doesn't really have mass resonance yet, or maybe I'm just like underestimating it.
No, I mean I think that's roughly true what you just outlined there, but it's not only small pockets of fringe type people with kind of incoherent political views on campuses who could be accused of violating basic tenets of free speech. You mentioned Facebook and the social media companies. Mm-hmm. You now have a situation where oftentimes journalists and left activists will be pressuring social media companies and other tech companies to kind of like implement speech codes mm-hmm. or take disciplinary action on their behalf and kind of like mm-hmm. more wholly embody their political values. And that could be viewed.
Yeah, that's very dangerous. I think it's one thing to say that these tech giants really need to stop the dissemination of particular threats. Like, there's a, I'm looking across at this temple across the street from where we're sitting. If someone's like, you should shoot up that temple, we need to do something about this or whatever, that's something that should be taken down by a social media. That's common sense.
But that's never been permitted.
Yeah, of course. But the question is whether someone with conservative views, let's say a Christian minister whose views we might personally view as hateful, should be taken down or not. I think it's a very small step between saying this person is creating a type of animus that's unacceptable, and then looking at, let's say, the work of myself or people around me, because a lot of our politics is based on stoking animus. We stoke animus of the bourgeoisie. We
believe animus is good, actually.
Yeah, we believe in a certain type of politics that doesn't divide people on the basis of their race or religion or sexual orientation or whatever else, but that divides people on the basis of their class, and that has a conception of power and struggle and all these things. I mean, I myself am not even jokingly like in favor of any form of violence, be it state violence or whatever else. But my politics is about expropriating and taking shit away from people on the basis of their class position, not their descriptive identity, but their class.
It's inherently divisive.
Exactly.
It's intended to be divisive.
It's intended to be divisive. It's intended to stoke strong feelings and whatnot. And
why couldn't some business person say, Jacobin magazine is threatening violence of a kind, meaning they want to expropriate my wealth, therefore YouTube or Twitter or whoever should take remedial action on my behalf to penalize them and not allow them to express that speech.
We spend hundreds of dollars every year advertising a guillotine poster on Facebook. That's how we help sustain, pay our staff healthcare and things like that. It's like advertising guillotine posters on Facebook. That doesn't even take a big leap for someone to say this is unacceptable.
No, that's pretty darn close to like actual political violence being advocated.
Yeah, of course, exactly.
Even though you're not literally calling for any specific individual to be guillotined.
Yeah, exactly. We're calling for even more like a class of people. I'm just kidding.
Right.
But no. I mean, I don't even in the most extreme like instances believe in like the death penalty or whatever else. But it's a symbol, and it's a symbol that reminds us of our history, and we're proud of the legacy of 1789. We're proud of the Enlightenment tradition that our politics come from. And that's why we have this. This poster, among others, and also people tend to, end up buying it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm wary of that. I think that does exist. The campus stuff, I just find more like silly, and I dismiss it. Though in certain instances, of course, like it's a serious matter for certain professors and for other people in this environment. But I think of it largely from my perspective as a distraction, and also potentially losing sight of the fact that most students are actually undergoing lots of stress and pressure and have all sorts of social problems. But those students are actually at schools like CUNY and SUNY Binghamton and like a handful, that there are actual working class students that are at public institutions and these other smaller underfunded community colleges or whatnot that are dealing with all sorts of problems and actually do not care about like the Vietnamese food as cultural appropriation. So I just don't want to focus on these rich kids because they're going to dominate society as soon as they're out of school anyway. So it's like, why do they get the attention from the time they're, age 2 to the time they're like, 80?
Yeah, I mean, and to the extent that the college speech issues are actually relevant, it really is confined to a narrow spectrum of liberal arts colleges that cost like $55,000 a year minimum to attend, like Oberlin and stuff. So it just isn't reflective of the experience that most college students have. But I agree with you overall that it really is relatively trivial, even though some of the expressions that it takes can be laughable and like maybe worthy of mockery, but shouldn't be blown out of proportion.
Right. We need a left willing to mock it, but also willing to like understand how small its impact is.
Which is why I brought up as a more relevant concern this notion of at least putatively left-wing activists and journalists forging alliances with like YouTube and Google to punish their perceived political adversaries. Like that actually is a more relevant.
But also we're at a time when people are just calling themselves left and burnishing their credentials when there's even a handful of these most vocal people were even Hillary over Bernie people in 2016, and they made this very sudden conversion to rose emoji Twitter.
Right.
They for them politics is fundamentally about capital G, capital D, capital G, capital T, doing the right thing or doing good things. And I really just completely messed up those acronyms.
That's all right. We got the gist.
So and it's a moralistic conception of politics. It's fundamentally a middle class conception of politics. It doesn't really have agency or actors. And it's a conception of politics that lends itself to just asking a figure of authority for help and support. And these figures of authority, of course, are mega corporations, or it's even the state, or whatever else.
And that's literally what at least this one journalist at Vox, Carlos Maza, did, where he said, he used the word, I need protection. He used the word protection from YouTube in order to, insulate him from the threats that were being foisted upon him allegedly by this right-wing YouTube guy.
Right.
So it's like that level of, that's actually the way in which they're phrasing their appeals.
Yeah, and it's a difficult appeal for people to criticize, because in other words, we have what's essentially an abstract objection to the empowerment of corporations in this way. Mm-hmm. And what they have is something concrete and visceral, which is, and I'm sure me and you, I'm sure lots of other people who are kind of public figures will get this, tons of threats and attacks or whatever else. But what I mean is when someone's describing their personal experience and we have an abstract thing, it's often like a battle you can't win. Mm-hmm. But I think it is important for us to respond the correct way, be like, I completely understand, you're under stress, whatever else, but YouTube is not going to save you or anyone else, and this is like a dangerous road to thread upon.
And also, you chose a profession that necessarily entails stress by making provocative political statements on the internet. I mean, what do you expect?
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't want the resulting stress, then maybe you're not in quite the right line of work.
Yeah, and I think there is a big difference between targeted particular threats, like if, like if blueprints to your home is being posted on the internet and photos of your family, whatever.
Sure.
But I think
this is all classical incitement stuff that would not fall within the remit of protected speech.
Exactly. And I think we need to be, if anything, defending this encroachment rather than kind of defending these values in speech against encroachment rather than encouraging more of it. And we should be happy with the fact that we live in a country where the state itself actually has a far more limited scope than even in some other Western democracies. The state
virtually all other Western democracies.
Exactly. We have a terrible constitution when it comes to actually administering the kind of social change that we need in this country, but it, at the very least, has given us space to establish certain freedoms for the press and whatnot against state interference. Jacobin and other venues are operating and getting subsidized bulk rates from the post office or whatnot to push socialist propaganda. This would not be in the case in a lot of places.
Yeah. You've kind of alluded to some of this so far, but one passage in the book that made me just envision left Twitter people having their heads explode was toward the end where you said identity-based struggles have succeeded mainly in diversifying our elites, and furthermore, identity politics, you claim, quote, has become an agenda of inclusionary neoliberalism in which individual qualms can be addressed but structural inequalities cannot. Okay, so this is a running debate that usually makes people completely lose their minds, at least online, which I get is kind of a myopic conception of how politics gets discussed. But nonetheless, so when you're writing that, are you cognizant that people are actually going to melt down in anger?
No, because, essentially, if you read my book and whatever else, Jacobin, some of my writing, has, flair and style, but at its core, it's completely generic, rote, Marxist and democratic socialist thought. I don't claim much originality in the basis of it. And what I say there in that passage is essentially what I believe, which is that I am against all forms of oppression. I believe in struggles against oppression, but I believe those struggles against oppression need a bedrock of class. If they're going to be majoritarian, if they're going to be part of a majoritarian movement that could actually make change. And it's such common sense to people that their material lives and their income security and their access to healthcare and all these things are the most important things in their lives. It's clear to every single oppressed person in the country. It's clear to every working class person that actually how much money in your wallet actually is the determining thing in your life. And yeah, so I think it's like I write and say whatever I think without much fear, partially because I know that I critics, whatever critics will say aside, that I know that I don't have kind of racist or backward views. Therefore, I'm not really afraid what comes out. But also, I do think a lot of these things are in fact even consensus within the left, or it's a large portions of it.
Yeah, but when you say that identity-based struggles have succeeded mainly in diversifying our elites, there are people who are going to hear that and say, "Wow, you're really diminishing these gains that we believe we've made. You're kind of reducing it."
Name some of the gains, though.
Well, I agree with you, but I'm just kind of trying to represent
what the... Think about what the Civil Rights Movement was. Civil Rights Movement was a broad movement with, at the very least, social democratic or democratic socialist leadership for actually tackling institutional racism. Not institutional racism in the vaguest sense where people can't quite identify where it is or what institutions or what's to change, but institutional racism in the sense that there's Jim Crow, there's the need for the Voting Rights Act and whatnot. That was half the struggle, and the other half was for economic demands, jobs and justice. We didn't get the latter half, we got the former, but we actually conquered through the leadership of people who did have kind of a class-based analysis of the world and use that analysis to inform their struggle against oppression. So, that was a gain, but that wasn't kind of a cultural or, ID politics gain. And beyond that, if you think about, the best example I could give people who kind of focus excessively on the cultural sphere, the representational sphere, and I think this is the most, I guess, not necessarily valid, because I think it's incorrect, but at the very least good faith criticism that could come from. Well, you Marxists downplay the impact of culture of like, oh, didn't Will and Grace open up space for yada yada?
Yeah.
Whereas, think about
Or the Cosby Show.
yeah, exactly. Think about a movie from the 40s or something. Let's say Casablanca, because it's a movie most people would have watched. And think about the depiction of, is it Sam? The Sam plays the piano in Casablanca.
Well, I don't even remember.
But anyway, so the black piano player who works at Rick's bar, how deferential he is to Rick and the other the white patrons, where he's like, yes, sir, whatever else, like a very kind of like happy-go-lucky, quiescent, whatever. That's the depiction of Black Americans in popular culture through the 20s, 30s, 40s. It's like meek, like quiescent people. If you then flash forward and then you start watching movies, let's say you didn't know any history, you just went from that to watching movies in the 70s, 80s, 90s. What's the depiction of Black Americans? It's like kind of quite the opposite. It's like defiant, rebellious to authority, challenging, and particularly like the power of white characters or whatever else. So what happened? Like, did all of a sudden everyone get in a room and all the writers were like, oh, we really need we signed this little pledge and we're committed to showing empowered black figures? No, there was a political struggle. And the capitalist power structures, many of them, in the U.S., like entirely white power structures, were threatened by the rise of this left-of-center kind of black liberation struggle, and connected to that other kind of militant struggles. And the cultural depiction followed from that. I'm just using that example because if you actually just think of history, it's driven in a very straightforward way.
Let's go with contemporary quote struggles. I mean, people who perceive themselves as being involved today in identity-based struggles, meaning movements that are centered around their gender identity, racial identity, that kind of stuff. They would look at you saying, oh, all you're doing ultimately is helping to diversify our elites, and they would be offended by that because they think, oh, no, we're working toward material change in the realm of criminal justice or of gender equity or whatever.
Well, it depends what they're doing. I mean, in other words, like, we just have to look at these movements. In other words, if somebody's fighting for, let's say, maintaining or expanding abortion access in this country, I don't think they're engaged in identity-based struggle. I think they're engaged in kind of a core working class demand of expanding kind of this access. If someone's involved with a concrete criminal justice reform, then yes, of course, if certain sentencing laws were changed, that it would help. It would help people. But the dominant thrust of organizing in the absence of class-based movements has been towards just representational gains that have meant something. I also mentioned in the book that, I guess as long as we're going to live in a class-stratified society, as long as we're going to live in capitalism, it actually would be fairer if half the CEOs were women or 10% of them were black or white. No, it would. Because, it actually, yeah, sure, if we're going to live in this terrible society that's built on the basis of class exploitation, let's try to limit the other oppressions that are involved here. But we can't lose sight of the fact that there's actually a majority of people that would benefit from a different arrangement. And in fact, we shouldn't apologize for caring about the conditions of, let's say, white men, because white men constitute, 35% of the population or something like that, and the majority of them are working class, and the majority of them suffer similar anxieties and fears as the rest of working class people. So it seems odd that the left would just write off segments of the population as hopelessly reactionary. It's very anti, materialist.
Yeah. Well, it does seem as though, at least in some quarters of the left, that just using the term white men is like almost an epithet, or at least it has an almost sinister connotation whenever it's invoked, which is why there's another passage that is on that score, which I think would also cause the excessively woke online people to writhe on the floor in fury, which is that you said that like Trump, Bernie was able to, quote, speak to the anger of white workers who had seen their living standards decline without even the limited social gains other groups in the Democratic coalition could point to. So you're I'm not accusing you of this, but I can hear in my head others accusing you of legitimizing these kind of like reactionary grievances on the part of that segment of the coalition that Trump could speak to.
Well, the grievance isn't. I mean, the grievance is rooted in the fact that their living standards are in decline. The leftist argument isn't denying the fact that their living standards are in decline and there's a reason to be angry. The leftist argument is saying that their living standards is not in decline because of immigrants and minorities. So, of course, So in other words, like we fight against this zero-sum game notion and the capitalist class pitting us against each other, but the grievance is real and it has lots of different sources. So in other words, we criticize the manifestation of the grievance, not the grievance itself. And I think that's pretty, straightforward.
Do you think there are parts of the left who would almost deny, in a way, the grievance itself? Maybe not the ones that you feel most affiliated with. But.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are parts of the people who identify on the left that they would deny, anything involving, I think whose vision of politics is the politics built around the most marginalized and not building coalitions with other oppressed people. There's parts of the left that would deny the fact that the majority of white Americans are oppressed. They are because the
life expectancy is declining.
Yeah, and also the condition of being a worker is oppression. In our case, typically among socialists, or has historically been, that any privilege that a worker has, even the most privileged section of the working class, is a relative, not an absolute privilege. So in other words, if me and you, let's say, if we were just regular people, not whatever the hell we do for a living. Right?
I don't even know how to characterize myself anymore.
Let's say if me and you were working class people.
I'm a content producer.
We're working at the same restaurant or whatever, and I'm a person of color, you're a white person.
A white dude, I think, is how you refer to it.
And let's say there's a new coalition or a campaign for a set of demands. Chances are we both benefit from it. I might have stand more to gain from it, but you would also benefit from it. So in relative terms, I'm getting something a little bit more than you. And in relative terms, you currently have a little bit more privilege than me. But in absolute terms, we both have something to gain.
Right.
That's a logic of any majoritarian politics. You can't make change with just piecing together the most marginalized segments of the population. And also, you need to think about politics as far as the oppressed. We don't support the oppressed because we feel sorry for them. In real left-wing politics, you support the oppressed because they have latent power. That's what Marxists are so obsessed with the working class, because we look at a bunch of teachers and nurses and longshore workers and whatever else and be like, if only you knew, if only you were able to exercise your power to withhold labor, you could grind this whole city to a halt and you could make demands. So whereas I think there's a certain moralism that's pervading politics. And if you care about the fate of trans people and refugees and all these other more hyper-marginalized groups, you need to create that powerful working class coalition, and you need to make sure they're included within that coalition. But you can't kind of go it alone with just the most marginal beyond anything like, self-defense, whatever else. So, of course, if you're a trans person, you should organize among other trans people or among some basic demands, but your goal has to be to connect your struggles with a wider struggle. But all this is, so in other words, I think of this as so common sense, so uncontroversial that I can dismiss. And maybe I don't register it enough because I don't take a step back. I just immediately just dismiss any criticisms of this.
It might seem so commonsensical to you, but I really think, at least, when I talk to people who are non-leftists, and when I talk to conservatives who I think are at least strive to be operating in good faith, their conception of what the left now consists of is derived from what they see as these vocal, screeching, activist journalist types who would not subscribe to virtually anything you just said there, or at least not to 75% of it. And they would take extreme exception to white men, quote unquote, viewing themselves to be marginalized in any respect, even comparatively speaking, even in relative terms, you know. So like those people, I mean, I think it's not commonsensical to them. It's not if you're in your corner of the world, I think it is commonsensical. But for people who engage in politics at maybe a little more casual level,
what this is what I also found too, though, is that this is the power of democratic socialism and, the far left in this moment. Whereas I think we have a certain appeal that is more majoritarian than the new appeal of the center left. So in other words, like Bernie Sanders, someone whose roots are on the far left, even though he's now kind of obviously like I said, left to center kind of reformist, his way of thinking about the world, his way of describing the world has resonance with people who aren't on the left.
Right.
I could do an event. I'm actually doing next week, 6-7 events in like Texas and other places. I could do events with like random people and like at least speak in kind of a left populist vernacular and like express at least my worldview with simplicity and clarity. And I think that's the goal, what we should train democratic socialists to do, because the center left is going to implode and just turn into like a mix of like the Oppression Olympics plus Hey Arnold, which Hey Arnold character are you kind of BuzzFeed quizzes.
Oh, okay.
It's like they have no like worldview. They have no politics. They have no sense of history. They have nothing.
Remember Helga's last name was Pataki?
Yes, I do remember that.
What was that about? I mean, was that like a reference that I couldn't pick up on the
George was the mayor then. Oh, sorry, was the governor.
He was, but like, I guess she was supposed to be like a stealth conservative. I don't know. Who cares? Well, no, I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned this in the book, and I had been kind of documenting this throughout 2016, but Bernie did unusually well among self-described moderates and conservatives, at least in certain parts of the country, mainly rural white areas. Self-described conservatives in those areas tended to vote for Bernie by large margins, which is what I think lends credence to the idea that the program he's promoting, to the extent that it's in conflict with the center left, is probably more broadly popular because it's just more universalizable.
And also, we're anti-establishment at our best. We come in as outsiders who aren't tied to what people. So when people call themselves moderates, for example, often they mean they don't like the liberal Democratic Party, they don't like the conservative Republican Party, so they call themselves moderates. Many of them, though, believe in things like Medicare for all.
Yeah. So let me give you one criticism of Bernie that I'm interested in hearing you respond to. And, people will know I've been transparent about this. I voted for Bernie in 2016. I worked for the Young Turks, which is basically like a pro-Bernie propaganda organ, which is fine. It's just kind of what they are. They don't even hide it.
It's RT for Bernie.
Yeah, it is. That actually gets to the question, which is that on this whole issue of Russian interference, which you kind of briefly mentioned in the book as like an excuse that Democrats use to explain away Hillary's loss, Bernie has basically adopted the mainstream center-left view. For the most part.
I don't think so.
Why not?
Well, I think that he often is like, the problem is in Russia. He said that before. He said multiple times he's dismissed blaming the election on Russia. He's said that many times. But as far as stoking, am I worried if Bernie is like, if Bernie wants to, in a populist way, say that Trump's too close to Vladimir Putin, I'm fine with that. I don't care. If he wants, if there's some sort of
in a is there a populist way, quote unquote, to say that? It's intertwined with the kind of establishment democratic narrative.
Yeah. No, I don't, as you can tell, as you know from the book and from, whatever, I am maybe not on the same level as you, but I'm up there as far as my anti-Russiagate stuff. I don't think Bernie really engages in Russia.
I received a positive shout out in Jacobin magazine for my Russia skepticism. So now I have the bona fides.
Yes, definitely.
To demonstrate that. So that was by Branko.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce his last name? I read it in my Google Docs.
I always butcher it. He's a good Serbian.
Branko something.
Yes.
But it's just that I haven't seen any skepticism, even an iota of skepticism toward this narrative evinced by Bernie from the outset, and at least from my vantage point, it's been insanely destructive in all kinds of ways. And so for the leading light of the American left,
Bernie hasn't engaged in it though. Really,
he has though.
No.
He has on occasion.
Okay.
He basically, I mean, I could pull up the statements for you, which I don't actually have in front of me right now. But like, there are statements, not as many as like an Adam Schiff type, right? But he said, that how horrible it is that Hillary had to both run against Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in 2016.
That's terrible. That's a terrible statement. What can I say?
He did say that.
Yeah, that's bad.
So like, just how should somebody who roughly has an affinity with Bernie, at least to the extent that I voted for him in 2016, what's the best way for somebody of my inclination to think about that?
You should compartmentalize and still vote for Bernie. It's not a major issue of principle. It has no actual bearing. If Bernie was actually saying that, in other words, it's inaccurate, it's bad strategy, whatever, we should criticize it. But it's not like Bernie's saying, we need to mobilize troops and send peacekeepers to the Ukraine or whatever else. It's not like it's connected with. In other words, if Bernie is president, you're going to see the drawdown of tensions in Eastern Europe. You're not going to see continued expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe. You're not going to see the stoking of Russia. I don't think that his foreign policy is going to be different.
You're going to see
a thaw.
You're going to see an escalation in like push for social media censorship on the ground that like Russia manipulated the internet to elect Trump or something.
You're not going to see any of that if Bernie's elected. That Bernie will be a repudiation of that. He's from the wing of the progressive movement that is a repudiation of the Russiagate hawks. And he deserves your support on that basis, even if this is maybe my inner like old like Socialist Party CP line, of like, yeah. So I'm not quite Young Turks in my that I or at least your depiction of the Young Turks, and that I'm willing to criticize Bernie about certain things. But yeah, I don't think this is a deep.
But I actually think it is a deeper issue than maybe you would appreciate. Bronco might actually agree.
Right, yeah, Bronco probably agrees with you, yeah.
Which is that, this has dominated American politics for 3 years. Maybe people on the Jacobin left don't want to engage with it as much as with a handful of exceptions like Bronco. Mm-hmm. But every single day when people turn on the news, chances are it's going to be something Russia or Mueller related or now impeachment related. So for Bernie to virtually never have challenged any aspect of it for 3 years gives me pause as to what extent can he be trusted now to challenge narratives that are being propagated by establishment organs. I just feel like if we were in the 1980s right now, it was like Burlington Bernie, he would have challenged it to some.
It's different
extent.
Because it's like a center right narrative about a right wing presidency and another right wing leader. You know what I mean? It's like it's completely different. In other words, if I was running
ideological implications.
If I was running Bernie's campaign,
it's a CIA, FBI conspiracy theory. That's how it was originated.
Right.
Which came to dominate all of American politics, which has been used to stifle speech, marginalize dissent, expand the federal law enforcement apparatus. That actually is of serious substance, and it could easily be used against a President Bernie, given the precedents that have been enshrined in the way that state power is now.
Okay, these precedents have been in place for a long time. I mean, the state has always had this power, and if Bernie is elected, you're going to see like something close to a very British coup kind of scenario of like, a media conspiracy along with, businesses shaking up the markets and whatever else. So he's going to have to contend with a lot. I would say that I agree with you in substance. But if I was running Bernie's campaign, I would just ignore the issue. I wouldn't engage in the rhetoric. So I disagree when Bernie engaged in the rhetoric. Mm-hmm. I think he should continue to push against the impeachment drums, which he has been doing.
No, he didn't. He endorsed initiating impeachment proceedings. He did.
He's vacillated. He's vacillated on it.
He didn't vacillate it. He endorsed it. It's clear as day what he said.
You mean like 2-3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, but initially he was pushing against it. What did he say?
He got dragged kicking and screaming because Warren absorbed all the political energy from being out front and aggressive on that.
Yeah.
issue.
I mean, again,
he's on record now as endorsing
impeachment proceedings. Yeah, I think that's bad. I think this is one danger with the Sanders campaign too, which is he needs to win the Democratic primary, but he needs to not be just another Democrat.
Right.
I feel like he's losing some of his anti-establishment credentials by aping the Democratic Party line on too many things, and even talking about our party or the Democratic Party, people liked him partially because he was apart from all that.
Yeah.
You know,
And that's fundamental to his political character.
It's fundamental to his character.
I mean, the Liberty Union Party was, on an essential level, explicitly separate from the Democratic Party.
Exactly, but he also has to win a Democratic primary, so it's it's tricky. But yeah, I care about the core of his program. I think some of these things are secondary to his program. They might give me pause or whatnot, but once he's in power, he's going to have plenty of actual pressure to compromise and retreat on core political commitments, and that's when I think I'll want to be very aggressive, not on this. So in other words, if he started talking about Medicare for all co-pays and things like that to a greater extent, if he kind of starts backsliding on that, then I'd be very worried. But I guess I'm just less focused on this.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. From a strategic standpoint, what you're saying makes absolute sense. I'm just not really looking at it in the same kind of through the same kind of strategic lens. It's almost like a more journalistic outlook, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not a journalist. I am also not a very good propagandist, but my goal in a lot of my work is to help Bernie Sanders win the Democratic primary, because I think he's the best candidate to spearhead issues that will help tens of millions of Americans.
Yeah.
And so in other words, which is different than the perspective of a journalist. If I was a journalist, I'd be pretty terrible. Actually, I'd be one of the honest ones, because a lot of these journalists, their goal is to help Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris or whatever else. They just will never say it that explicitly. Yeah. That's why I'm considered, and a lot of the people around kind of our milieu, democratic, real socialist writers and thinkers, are considered hacks by some of these people, because we're very honest and upfront about the type of politics we're engaging with. And we're all engaging in politics. They're just engaging in a different type of class politics than we are.
Oh, yeah. I mean, being a journalist is not mutually exclusive at all with being open about one's preferences, which I always am. Right. Which is, people who follow me know that I'm positively disposed toward Tulsi Gabbard, in part because she actually has challenged the Russia nonsense, unlike almost everyone else in the party. Doesn't mean that I'm endorsing her over anybody or anything like that, but I think it's at least worth amplifying the way that she is actually bucking consensus.
I'm sure the Teen Gravel Twitter account has been good on Russiagate.
They have. Mike Gravel has been on the podcast before, which is good.
Yeah.
He doesn't have a whole lot else to do, really. He just kind of sits in his house in Seaside, California, and does podcasts. But nonetheless, it was enjoyable. So you
Seems like a lovely man.
He is. So you brought up, we mentioned Warren. There's a whole debate now that seems to be raging as to, a lot of people want to group Sanders and Warren under the same vaguely, quote, progressive umbrella. And it's just if you studied their political histories, yeah, maybe in practical terms, in a way, their governance would have some similarities. But Sanders rose to electoral politics through these kind of fringe third-party groups that were explicitly hostile to the two-party system. Whereas Warren, she entered electoral politics through Harvard Law, which is just a different life trajectory. So let me read to you a quote from somebody who I'm sure you know and love, Matthew Iglesias.
Ah, yes.
Who wrote on June 12th at 9:57 a.m., "A lot of people who I think are serious socialists in some more profound way put a lot of stock in the putative ideological contrast between Sanders and Warren. But Bernie keeps making it clear that his socialism," he puts in scare quotes, "New Deal liberalism is just New Deal liberalism like Warren's politics." So he's saying there's basically no difference.
Well, I don't know. With Iglesias, the frustrating thing is I actually really do, probably way more than I should, like Iglesias as a figure. If I could snap my finger and take Iglesias away from the public sphere or keep him there, I'm kind of maybe would keep him there.
I would too. I find he has his charms.
And he's also brave enough to just say what he thinks, even if he gets even if what he thinks is abhorrent. At some level, at least he's out there and he's not playing some of the same games as other figures in his position would be. He's not pandering to the mob or whatever else. But on this issue, it's very frustrating because we've been making the elaborate case over hundreds and hundreds of pages and op-ed things or whatever, what the difference between Bernie and Warren is and why we think the differences actually have significance.
Yeah.
And he'll just continue to say this and just not respond to the actual work, whereas he actually does thoughtfully engage with other things we do. So, I mean, I think that for one, it's a concept of power and building an opposition movement. Sanders speaks in a way that foregrounds this kind of polarization in society. He talks about he sets up our revolution networks. He talks about basically class struggle in a way that Warren does not talk about. So politics isn't just a series of policy positions that you add up and it equals politics. To have politics, you need to have a theory of power, a theory of change, a theory of all these things, and that's I think the key differentiation. It does matter to me that Bernie is a socialist because he was trained as a socialist. He was trained to think that the world was divided between working people and capitalists, and that their interests are inherently opposed. He's not a tinkerer. He's kind of, I think, would be able to spearhead something similar to what Trump has done. Trump has created a polarization, created a movement around him, and was able to, I guess, shake up the Republican establishment and force a segment of the Republican establishment to go along with this program, but kind of using the bully pulpit and in a way to move certain parts of the politics in the U.S. to the right. I think Sanders can do that, but to the left.
And in practical terms, I mean, to the extent that
so the other practical thing, by the way, is that it's not true what he's saying about her policies. She's unreliable on Medicare for all, and she's unreliable. Like, where's her comprehensive K through 12 plan? I think one reason why her K through 12 plan is so weak, and she's so weak on charters, is she's connected to a network of so-called left, like liberal think tanks, that include people who are still very skeptical about teachers' unions, who are very skeptical about, who believe fundamentally in school choice and whatnot, even if they now are muting those beliefs because the tides have changed in the Democratic Party.
And her agenda on foreign policy is kind of underdeveloped.
Yeah, it's bad. I mean, a lot of it's bad. Like, if she, listen to things she talks about Israel. Like, obviously you could say, oh, Sanders is a two-stater, yada, yada. But he hasn't been saying things like Israel's our best friend in the Middle East. He's been saying, no, this government is a criminal government.
And he responded to pressure in 2016 to at least get more aggressive rhetorically on Palestine.
Yeah, and if you look at how well he does among Muslim voters in the Democratic Party, he's going to clean up places like Michigan and certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn that are like heavy Pakistani, Bangladeshi populations. He did really, really well too. And for those of you on the left who think that Sanders doesn't go far enough on Palestine, like, talk to Palestinians. Talk to, people are actually thrilled when he even, mentions Palestine. He talks about this. He's pushing the party in the right direction on the issue of Palestine. On the other issues, he's been consistently anti-war on Iran. He's been, I think, on the key foreign policy challenges of the past year at least, he's had a very clean record. And then, obviously, if you go back to the 80s, he's like a sterling anti-imperialist, and he had some shaky moments in the 90s, but his record throughout
Serbia.
the arc, Serbia, Bosnia, I think,
Iraq sanctions,
and those are the three big blemishes on his record that we should, and Afghanistan, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's true.
So these are the blemishes on his record. We should criticize him for it, but we should see it in the arc of his politics, which has been anti-war, anti-imperialist politics. And the 90s were a weird time for everyone,
Yeah. Yeah, well, it just seems like I know people who are foreign policy focused have taken a liking to Tulsi just because she prioritizes it more than Sanders ever really did, and she kind of connects as inseparable foreign policy and excess militarism abroad, especially on regime change and stuff like that, to a domestic policy agenda. She's saying you almost can't have, if you have that agenda happening on the foreign policy domain, then you can't.
Yeah,
really...
so I actually think she's wrong about that. I mean, in other words, I agree with that at the rhetorical level, because I'm an anti-imperialist, and also I want progressive change. But yeah, of course you could have Britain had still had colonies abroad when it built an NHS and whatever else. So, you can actually, in fact,
well, yeah.
You know what I mean? But yes, I agree with
She's not saying it hyper literal.
Yeah. But
she's just kind of trying to create a popular conception where the two are more linked than is generally understood.
What I would say is she just doesn't have a base. She has no traction. I don't think she's that compelling as a political figure. I agree with her on a lot of this foreign policy stuff. But Sanders is the candidate that's actually viable and real, and that who can be pushed and shaped and pressured in that direction. It would be good if Tulsi was at the was in the debates.
She is in the debates.
Was what kind of stays and was in the. Is she in the main card or is she in the? Oh, they're doing it in a weird way. They're doing it randomly.
Yeah, there's no kitty table debate.
Yeah,
technically, but she's on night 1 with Warren.
Okay. So I mean, it'll be good to hear her out there, and hopefully Gravel makes the second debate, and hopefully he doesn't talk about at what temperature steel melts or whatever.
Oh God, I kind of wish he does that actually. Oh God, that Vice interview he did was brutal. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I just heard about it and I couldn't click the link.
Yeah,
it made rounds in Jacobin Slack, and I was like,
yeah, I would have been better off not having watched it.
Yeah.
So, a couple more quick things. 5 minutes, okay. So you were at Bernie's speech in Washington last week, where he kind of outlined his vision for democratic socialism. Some people were saying that, like, why even bother staying attached to that label, because he's basically just calling for the completion of the New Deal rather than the kind of socialism that you go to great lengths to describe in the book. So what's the utility there for it and remaining so tethered to that particular label? Yeah. Is that like a valid criticism?
For one, like, why does he have to defend or explain what he means by democratic socialism? Well, it's because he's been calling himself a democratic socialist in the 1960s, so the term is out there. He can't call himself a New Deal liberal because he's never called himself a New Deal liberal before. Also, they're going to call him a socialist no matter what. If there's a candidate that the Republican Party or the right in America, or even like centrists in the Democratic Party, aren't calling a socialist, that's a bad candidate. Yeah. They're going to call any decent thing that we're going to have socialism.
They're going to call Joe Biden a socialist.
Yeah, I don't think so. Socialism is too popular now for them to call him. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But so I think one, they're going to red bait him anyway. Two, what he actually defines and lay out is a vision of extending democracy through enshrining social rights. He talks about freedom being the freedom from the tyranny of a bad employer, a low-wage job, not having health insurance, whatever else. A lot of these core commitments, I think, are fundamentally socialist core commitments. And also the fact that he believes that he stands on the side of working people when they're in fights against capital. I mean, like, to me, this does fit in a broad sense the vision of what democratic socialism is, even if his immediate sets of demands are social democratic. He's chosen at a rhetorical level to tie it in with FDR, but he's focusing primarily not on what the New Deal actually was, but on the unfulfilled promise of FDR's 1944 address, in which he laid out the Second Bill of Rights, which would have enshrined whole spheres of life, housing, education, healthcare, that would have been decommodified. It would have been taken out of the market, and these things would have been enjoyed as social rights.
Bernie says he died and it never happened.
He died and it never happened. I think that's fine. It's fine rhetoric. I think that there's some hazy parts of the history, but it's okay. But has been a pivot in Bernie Sanders. He's gone from being the champion of Debs and the champion of like initially the Socialist Party or the Young People's Socialist League, then the Liberty Union Party. He's gone from being an electoral, it didn't mean he was a member of it, but an electoral of the Socialist Workers' Party. He's gone from kind of the far left and our patron saint, the last mass figure we really had in Eugene Debs, to now trying to contend for power within the Democratic Party and using the vehicle of the Democratic Party. So he swapped out Debs for FDR.
Right.
But I think that change is largely cosmetic. I think the core of his politics is intact. Does he subscribe to exactly my vision of change? No, but I hear a lot of it in there. Even he had this line, this beautiful line in the speech, where he talks about the business owners who appropriate the wealth that we collectively create as a nation. Mm-hmm. Like appropriating the wealth that we collectively create, that we like socially create or whatever else. Like
just music to your ears.
It's pure unadulterated Marxism, not cultural Marxism, pure Marxism.
Right.
You know, so I think there's there, and also I mean, at some degree, the left cannot be overconfident. We need to remember that we are living in the United States of America. It's 2019. Like probably. He's probably number 3 or number 4 most likely person, probably a distant 3rd or 4th, most likely person to be the next president of the United States. Mm-hmm. And he's laying out a speech about democratic socialists. He's calling himself a socialist. He's using this rhetoric that sounds like Marxism to like me and other like professional Marxists. You know? But I mean that with irony laden.
So you gotta like,
And-
you gotta like, you
Yeah,
if
just
you're in your
kinda
position, you have to
relax.
appreciate what's happening.
Yeah, just relax and like again,
relax.
if he
Or to quote Taylor Swift in her awesome new single, "You need to calm down."
yeah, you need to calm down.
Have you heard that song? It's really good.
No, I have not.
All right, you should look it up.
Not. No, yeah, I mean, I will. Sure,
All right,
sure.
let me ask you very quickly.
Yeah.
So I saw you get a little bit of trouble because you suggested that there were liberals and maybe some even left people who were trying to suggest that society needs to be oriented around combating the threat of Nazis rather than capitalists. And I put out a version of that criticism a while ago, and of course people were a little upset about it, to say the least. Basically, I was saying, look at what Joe Biden is doing. He launched his campaign dwelling on Charlottesville and saying, because of the specter of Nazis on the streets, restoring normalcy by way of me, Joe Biden, is the proper political choice. And if it were true that Nazis were actually roaming on every street corner of America, that would actually be rational. That's kind of just not what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I Mitt Romney, we would have to, we maybe need to install to like restore some sort of like normal,
Right.
like, But, I think that obviously where there are Nazis and they're threatening people and whatever else, like, it's fucking scary. It's scary to walk around and see a fucking skinhead. But you need to keep in mind that the main threat that we're facing, let's say on the right, the main is a right populism that's around Trump, that's unleashing further right forces, but primarily, by far, the largest portion is right populism. And this right populism was created in large part because of the policies of the political center. So we need to have both a sword and a shield. And our shield should be directed at the right, but our sword should be directed at the center. Not because we think that the center is more odious than the right, because in fact we want to undermine the social base for the right. We need to fight against austerity. We need actual politicians that stand for something. Because if it's just this defensive, anything but Trump mentality, then why Bernie? It doesn't make sense. If it's anything but Trump, then it should be Biden. I don't buy these arguments, by the way, that says Biden is inherently going to be way less electable than Sanders. No, I think Biden's perfectly electable.
Yeah, I think
if that's
so
your
too,
main
actually.
concern, just sure, vote for him. But you're going to end up with a shit president.
But do you think it's true that Nazis have been somewhat unduly elevated in the popular consciousness, and that's actually produced somewhat of a conservative reaction, at least within the Democratic Party, because they're saying, if that means that our primary objective politically should just be to simply remove the Nazi enabler. Forget about all the structural.
Yeah, and but also you're seeing this with the rhetoric of this is not normal.
Right.
Which in fact, actually a lot of what Trump has done has been pretty normal for a Republican administration. Let's also not forget, the Republican Party has always been laden with racism. Actually, in previous iterations, probably more explicit anti-black racism. Where did Ronald Reagan start his first campaign? He started Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is famous for nothing other than 3 civil rights organizers, one of them black, 2 of them Jewish, were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi by the Klan. Probably the only time you would ever root for the FBI is if you're watching the movie Mississippi Burning,
Right.
which depicts some of that. The Republican Party has always dabbled with forms of white nationalism. If anything, what's unique about Trump is that he's morphing some of this into a xenophobic populism, and often kind of a European type xenophobic populism. But yeah, that's the main threat, and the political center can defeat Trump. I think most people, even everyone besides for Mayor Pete, can probably defeat Trump.
I don't think Kamala could.
I think she can. Actually, by the way, I think here's my hottest, most controversial take.
Here we go.
That I haven't revealed anywhere, so you're going to hear her first. She's so much more reliable, Kamala Harris, on Medicare for All than Warren.
Oh.
I think she's number 2 to Sanders in her reliability just on this one issue.
Oh, wow.
Just from her statement.
I don't know how to react to that.
Yeah. Well, I think she's shit on everything else, and given who her friends are and social bases, if she's elected, we're not going to come close to getting it. But
why do you think it is fundamentally, and now we'll end, that the left and the center left, or some combination of thereof, has been so eager to elevate the profile of Nazis when, let's be honest, on a whole, Nazis, at least in terms of the people who are marching on the streets, proportionately speaking, it's not a huge number of people.
Well, I think here's one reason to focus on, I'm playing devil's advocate,
Right.
kind of. Here's one reason to focus on the small Nazi fringe, because we saw the way in which formerly fairly fringe ideas became more mainstream under Trump. And maybe as Trump is defeated in 2020 and his right populist kind of coalition drifts apart, some of them will return to the mainstream Republican Party. Some of them will return to not being politically active. But a layer, some sort of layer of this Trump coalition, maybe if it's just 5%, will actually drift towards a far right. And maybe we're seeing these movements as being the shell of a future movement. So smash it while it's a shell. But in order to smash it while it's a shell, you need to actually inflate the threat. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying this is the most rational response that I could give to it. I think it's a tactical mistake. Again, I think yes, if there's Nazis marching through your area, protests around them, do whatever. I don't like even the whole getting hyper focused on whether they should be punched in the face or not. Sure, if you really want to, just run away from the cops so you don't get we don't have good leftists being arrested for battery. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is a threat down the road that will it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy unless we start giving people dreams instead of just trying to protect them from nightmares.
I just think if you have to inflate a threat, you're doing something wrong. I mean, why not just deal with the threats as they actually exist?
Yeah, no, I agree. But again, I think there's a shell of something that might become something more real. But there's enough, our focus should be on the center and right populists. And we need to actually build a coherent left-wing alternative. And we build that alternative by differentiating ourselves from liberalism. It doesn't mean that liberalism is the main enemy, but it does mean that we're trying to articulate and create a coherent set of politics and our own institutions that are to the left of liberalism. And we don't think that the center can hold. So the future either belongs, I don't think it's to Nazis or socialists, but I think the future belongs to, at the very least, between right populists and social democrats and democratic socialists. I think that is, what we'll be looking at in the coming years. And we just need to think about issues a step removed from the emotional resonance of it. Because if you're thinking about politics, you have to be willing to just take a step outside and think about things like social weight, think about history, think about, in other words, I myself feel my most viscerally leftist when you're in a city and you see how there's vacant / luxury apartments and you see homeless people on the street. I think it's impossible to just not get angry at the how unjust the society is. But do I think that the homeless population is the subject of social change? No, I think that actually nurses and teachers that earn more money than I earn actually are probably a much more valuable part of our coalition. But it's not a question of moral worth. As human beings, we all have the same moral worth. It's a question of social and strategic power. And I think thinking in those terms, we're fighting to make sure it's not a lost art on the left. And the temptation that I battle with myself is that I viscerally hate so much of this media class and the professional middle class generally. I have to be wary to not just fight the culture war versus them, and to say that fighting the culture war versus these people is only useful in so far as it advances the class war, which is primarily not about these intermediary stratums. It's about the bourgeoisie and it's about the working class.
I find it useful to fight the culture war only insofar as it renders those people absolutely absurd and discredits them and shows how petty their fixations ultimately are.
But they also just don't have a sense of history. You know what I mean? They don't have sometimes it's actually more interesting to debate conservatives with a worldview,
right,
than with either people on the center right or center left that are very just reactive. And of course, I find some of the conservative worldviews.
Where history began on January 20th, 2017.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yep. But anyway. It was a distinct pleasure.
Yes,
Thank
it was very good. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And thanks for reading the book.
You're welcome.
I could tell you really read it because, those quotes haven't been used anywhere else.
I know, right? I used my own little special discernment skills to uncover those quotes and put you on the hot spot.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Bye. Alrighty, there you have it. Please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Please subscribe on YouTube, where these podcasts are always posted in full. If you so please, contribute via PayPal or Patreon or by some other method. Contact me if you desire one. and I will talk to you later.